Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome to NYU Journalism. I'm Jay Rosen. I've been teaching here for 30 years. So I think I have the right to be both the host and the guest, which is sort of what I'm doing here. There's wine and beer and some snacks in the back, so please help yourself to that. These are the instructions for the Wi-Fi guest network, which I hope is working. The hashtag for this event, for those who might want to participate that way, is WIC Trump, Winter is Coming Trump. If you want to get a good grade from the teacher, you might think about taking pictures of the slides and tweeting comments out. That won't hurt. Some of my students are here, so they know what I mean. This talk derives from two blog posts I wrote in December of last year with the title, Winter is Coming. And when I started to promote those posts, a lot of people said on social media, I love the Game of Thrones reference. These are really good, but I love the Game of Thrones allusion in your title. And I had never watched Game of Thrones. I had no idea that Winter is Coming was a Game of Thrones thing at all. I literally have never seen that show. I know that it exists. I know it's big, but I've never seen that show. I was actually referring to a book by Garry Kasparov, the former Russian chess champion, who is now kind of a dissident critic of Putin. And he wrote a book called Winter is Coming that is about Putin's Russia. And I thought I was referring to that, but everyone credited me with being groovy and up to date, which I'm happy to disillusion you of. I know that this is a subject, Trump and the press, on which people have a lot of opinions and a lot of passions, because I've been speaking about it around the country for about 5-6 months. So I have some slides and some ideas I want to share with you. That should take about 30 minutes. Then Ruth Ben-Ghiat, who is here to my left, an historian in our history and Italian departments who studies Italian fascism and Berlusconi and also Trump as an authoritarian, is going to give us a 10-minute response. And then we should have about 40 or 45 minutes of questions and comments from you, because, as I said, people have a lot of ideas on this subject. So let's get started. Part one of my presentation is about the predicament of the American press after Trump's election. As you'll see as I go through this, I break almost every rule of PowerPoint. No visuals. I put lots of text on my slides. I don't care what people say about what makes a good slide. I basically just share with you the best sentences that I can write, and I hope to imprint them on your minds. That's my PowerPoint technique. So, the predicament of the American press right now starts with an economic crisis in news business that has led to thinned out newsrooms and poor quality service, especially at the local level. And the local level is important because that's where people first form their news habits and learn the value of having good journalists around. When you have to make decisions about where to send your kid to school, it's good to have good journalism to tell you about the state of the school system. So when the quality of local news service deteriorates, something basic is snapped in the connection between the press and the public. The economic crisis in the news business therefore affects trust in a way that we have to consider. American journalists are operating in a low trust environment generally for almost all institutions. The big exception is the military and almost all leaders. The reason this is important is that these are the institutions and the names that show up in the news. And so the very thing that the news is about is itself an object of deteriorating trust, which has an effect on trust in the press. Trust in the news media itself is at historically low levels in the United States, especially but not only among Republicans. The Pew Research Center in July of 2016 said that only about 2 in 10 Americans, 22%, trust the information they get from local news organizations a lot, and 18% trust a lot the news they get from national organizations. Gallup in September of 16, Republicans who said they have trust in the media has plummeted to 14% from 32% a year ago. A year ago, 32%, 2016, 14%. That's a dramatic difference. On the political right, there is an organized campaign to discredit the mainstream press, and it's working. What I mean by an organized campaign is that it starts at the top with a president who projects resentment and gives haters permission to hate. And at the bottom, or the base of the pyramid, there's an army of online activists and trolls and bots that try to discredit stories they don't like and attack journalists. And then in the middle, between the two, are mediating institutions like Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity and Matt Drudge and, of course, Breitbart, which connect the top and the bottom. So that's a pretty organized structure for discrediting the mainstream press, and it's having an effect. When I say it's having an effect, this is part of what I mean. You've probably seen this chart if you follow the news about trust in the news media. This kind of polling where they ask the same question every year of a random sample of Americans is, to my mind, one of the more reliable forms of public opinion research, because when you can see trends over time, they definitely mean something. So here we see among Republicans, 52% had a great deal or fair amount of trust in 1998, down to 14% in 2016. Independents, which includes a lot of conservatives who are too conservative for the Republican Party, 55% in 1999, down to 30% in 2016. So that's a pretty dreary picture. 1/5 to 1/3 of the voters, this is my estimate, are increasingly lost to the national press. Theirs is an information sphere distinct from mainstream journalism. And these people are, of course, the core Trump supporters. They're also the voters who could defeat in a primary Republican congresspeople who aren't sufficiently Trumpish. It's an important thing to keep in mind. And we know from some very good research by Yochai Benkler and Ethan Zuckerman about a month ago that the media sphere, the information sphere that these people inhabit, is not only distinct from, but detached from the rest of the media. Meaning there is partisan media on the left, there's partisan media on the right, but among the Trump world, the information sources they listen to, the ones that have influence in their world, increasingly don't even touch the mainstream media. They are like a separate sphere. Political scientists call this asymmetric polarization, meaning both sides are being polarized, but one side is traveling further and is more extreme than the other. In my view, decades ago, the press took a wrong turn by focusing on the game of politics and connecting to voters through knowledge insiders had about how to win. David Broder, one of the most famous journalists of his generation, made his name by talking to more voters than any of his peers. Mark Halperin made his name by talking to more insiders than any of his peers. And the wrong turn that I'm talking about is somewhere in that difference. I also try to describe this as the church or the cult of the savvy in political journalism. You're familiar with it if you watch any television news and you hear someone introduced as Democratic strategist crystal ball. You know what I mean? Why are strategists, people in charge of winning elections and figuring out advertising campaigns and positioning candidates, why are strategists the people we hear from in news? These are the people who are charged with manipulating us. That's their business. See if you can remember like hearing this. Crystal, how will this play with white working class voters? You know the kind of discourse I'm talking about? That way of talking about people where you are asking how they're going to react to events in the news and how they can be brought to agree with this policy or vote for this candidate is addressing people not as fellow citizens, but as objects to be manipulated in a game. And this turn that political journalists took some time ago is a factor in the decline of trust. Money, talent, investment, prestige, and opportunity in journalism are increasingly concentrated in expensive cities on the coast where people are well-educated and cosmopolitan. I think most people know this, and it is a problem in journalism. The Trump core that is increasingly lost to the mainstream press doesn't live in those cities where journalists are most active and where journalists most want to gravitate to. If you're ambitious in journalism, the career path is very clear. You don't stay in Scranton, Pennsylvania. You try to jump to Philadelphia and then from there to New York and Washington. That's the way that you succeed as a journalist. And to a certain extent, ambitious people in the profession of journalism are leaving the core of Trump voters behind as they progress through their career. For journalists in this country, the events of 2016 were a devastating blow. But no season of hard reform has followed from those events. Partly because there's not time. After the election, you suddenly have to scramble and start covering a new president. So it's very hard to step back and say, what just happened? Because there's a new story to cover. But also, the press isn't very good at rethinking its routines. After it failed to detect a phony case for war in Iraq in 2002 and 2003, there wasn't a lot of step back and reflection and reform after that either. Now, I think most people in journalism understood that the events of 2016 in which they miscalled the election, in which they tried to alert people to the dangers of Trump and it didn't work, which they were pelted with hate and resentment at Trump events. I think most people in journalism realized that this was a devastating blow, and they're concerned about it, and they woke up on election day, the day after, and said, what do we do now? But it hasn't led to large changes. Now here's something where people in my business, academics, people who study politics, people who try to explain modern society, haven't done a good job. For reasons not well understood, reality seems to have become a weaker constraint in the political sphere of Western democracies. Why is this happening? I don't think we know why this is happening. Why is Putin-style propaganda, which aims not to convince you of a lie, but to make the search for truth exhausting and almost impossible, on the rise in the West? I don't think we know. Or to put it another way, why is CNN paying Jeffrey Lord to misinform us so that Anderson Cooper can correct him on air? Like, why is CNN paying both sides of that equation? It doesn't make any sense. We don't actually know why this is happening. We don't know where the demand for deliberately false reporting is coming from. We hear a lot about the supply of fake news, the people who are producers of fake news. But where is the demand for deliberately misleading reporting coming from? I don't think we know that either. So this is something that's hurting the press, but we don't actually understand the cause very well. Meanwhile, the power to inform people is shifting to the tech industry's platforms, which look with indifference on fourth estate functions that journalists were proud to inherit. This is such a bigger problem than finding the story and publishing it. The companies that produce news used to control the distribution of news. That was the way it used to work. But now these other platforms, Google, Apple to some degree, Snapchat, but especially Facebook, are taking charge of the relationship between people looking for news and the distributors of news. And one of the problems with that is that misleading information, deliberately false reporting, work just fine for Facebook in the sense that they're usable for targeting ads to people. You can target ads to people based on their tastes in propaganda and false reporting. And that is Facebook's business model. So it works fine. So this separation between the publisher of news and the distributors of news means that the people who care about being the press are no longer in charge of the relationship with the users of news. That's a problem. Part two of my talk is about what's different about Trump. More different than the press was ready for. Trump's authoritarian style gains traction by trashing the norms of democracy. But norms of democracy would give the press its place in public life. The government in the United States can't tell you what to print. It can't keep you from publishing a story that you've gotten. So the First Amendment is very strong in that way. But the First Amendment does not force the government to inform the press. It doesn't force the government to let the press know what's happening. Perfect example from this week. The White House has decided not to publish its visitors logs. The Trump White House has decided that who is coming to visit people in the White House is not public information. Now, there's no law that says it has to be. It's not a violation of the First Amendment to withhold that information, but informal norms of democracy caused previous presidents to make that information public. Obama tried to do what Trump did this week, and after thinking about it and getting criticized for it, he gave up on his attempt to keep these visitors logs private. But Trump doesn't care about that. And so now we have no idea who's coming to see the president and talk to his aides and seeking favors, because according to Sean Spicer, what really counts is not public information, but the privacy of the powerful people visiting other powerful people. That's an informal norm that once was observed by all presidents and is now being violated. Hate speech against journalists has become a routine by which Trump keeps faith with his core supporters and eludes accountability. What is hate speech? Well, it's whipping up resentment against members of a group simply because they are part of that group. That's what hate speech is. That is what Trump does routinely in his remarks about the press as horrible, disgusting creatures and enemy of the people. So that rhetoric is aimed at that same core of people who are increasingly lost at the press. And as I said before, it gives them permission to hate in kind, sort of following their leader, as it were. It's hard to have a fact-based debate when the leader of the free world observes no distinction between true and false and cannot be successfully fact-checked. I don't know how to say this and how to impress upon you how weird this is, but the president does not care if what he's saying is true. This is like a very important fact. It's not that other presidents were great truth tellers and always spoke honestly. Spin, lies, manipulation, propaganda are part of the American presidency, and all presidents have indulged in them routinely. But Trump is different in that he literally doesn't care whether what he's saying is true. And when he is fact-checked, he behaves differently than previous candidates and presidents. And Glenn Kessler, who's the fact-checker of the Washington Post, is pointing this out, is that all presidents try to get away with shading the truth. They will, if they think it's to their advantage, lie. But when they are called out on it, especially when they are called out by multiple news organizations, what they will do is not necessarily admit they were wrong, but they'll just stop saying that thing, or they'll alter the claim a little bit so that it fits within a rough factuality. And what's different about Trump is that he just doesn't care. And he just keeps saying things that everybody knows are false and that have been pointed out as false many times. And we've never had a president like that. So it's hard to have a fact-based debate when, in a sense, the most prominent voice in that debate doesn't care about facts in the first place. Many things Trump does best are explained best by narcissistic personality disorder. If you don't know what it is, look it up. Pretty sure there's a Wikipedia entry about it. But by their own code, their own commitment to fairness, journalists are reluctant to speak that way and report that and talk about that, which means they can't really describe what is going on. And this is an example of what I mean by a presidency without precedent. Many aspects of Trump's behavior are inexplicable unless you can call on knowledge of narcissistic personality disorder. An example would be, if you really crave media attention and media adulation and the approval of the press, then it might not be such a good idea to call them disgusting creatures and enemy of the people. Like, those two things don't actually make sense with one another. Craving adulation, disgusting people. But if you know what narcissistic personality disorder is, they do. Because narcissists believe themselves worthy of adulation, and if they don't get it, they react with rage and contempt. So it makes sense with that construct. It doesn't make sense without it, but it seems too harsh. It seems inappropriate. It seems like going too far to use terms like that, but if you don't use terms like that, you can't actually describe what's going on. That's a problem. With Trump in power, there's a surplus of eventfulness. He keeps everyone in a constant state of alarm. In a way, too much news. And the pace is itself a kind of propaganda, in that it exhausts people who try to stay informed and alert. And here I think he's exploiting a weakness of the news system in which one flood of daily reports is followed by another flood of different daily reports, and nobody actually thinks too much about what it all adds up to, and whether it's actually producing a coherent understanding of what's going on. Trump is exploiting that. So here's my read on the press's performance so far in coping with these conditions. Let's start with a really tricky question. Just do our job is the nearly unanimous sentiment in American newsrooms about how to respond to these conditions. But what if the job has changed because of everything I've said so far? Just do our job is something Marty Baron, who's the editor of the Washington Post, said in November of 2016 in a speech where he said he recognizes that many of his colleagues are anxious about what's going to happen under Trump. Will the new administration seize on every opportunity to intimidate us? Will we face obstruction at every turn? If so, what do we do? And he said the answer is pretty simple. Just do our job. Do it as it's supposed to be done. And I think there's a lot of appeal to this idea. Most journalists want to believe that. But they're in a situation that isn't like any previous situation they've been in, and so they have to change their job, but they don't know how to do that because they've never had to face anything like this before. And there's a bias towards keeping their routines. They want to keep their software rather than write a new program, because it's hard to write a new program and report the news at the same time. It's a problem. Here's an even bigger problem. The deep grammar of the presidency is being violated daily, but the press has never had to really notice such a thing, the deep grammar of the presidency, before, because presidents of both parties obeyed it. Here's the best example I can think of, is ever since the Cold War, every president has known that he has the power to blow up the world. And the presidency has adapted to those conditions by trying to reassure us that even though the president has the power to blow up the world, he probably won't do it because he's a steady, safe, consistent guy. He has the world's best information at his fingertips. The president has great advisors. The president has an apparatus around him for decision making that kicks in during an emergency. The president has the best intelligence. The president is never alone. The president is always on, as it were. And all of these things about the presidency seek to assure us that even though, yes, the U.S. president could blow up the world, it's okay because he's a very controlled figure. But Trump is an uncontrolled figure. And he reacts impulsively to what he sees on his television set. And he's likely to fly off the handle at any moment. And his Twitter feed is completely out of control. And instead of trying to assure our safety by being a steady, safe figure himself, which is how all previous presidents have tried to persuade us, Trump's idea is, I will keep you safe because your enemies think I might be a little crazy. You know what I mean? Like, I might blow them up. And that's why I will keep you safe. That is a completely different grammar of national security than U.S. presidents have tried to put forward since 1948 and Harry Truman. So now I'm going to give you like my grades for the press. I'm not actually going to use the cliche of letter grades, but these are the things that I think the press has been doing pretty well with. First, they beefed up White House coverage. They added a lot of people, which is very good because there's a lot of news. They also defended normal levels of access. And they were fairly successful at that, except that they failed to ask, is access to a fundamentally misleading White House really positive? Is that really something valuable? They also were successful in cultivating anonymous sources within the executive branch, because there's been a lot of people within the executive branch who want to talk to journalists, and they've succeeded at cultivating those people. And that's one of the reasons why they've been successful at digging deeply into the Russia connection, which is probably the most important story they've surfaced since Trump was inaugurated. Some more things they've done well: depicting palace intrigue and internal turmoil within the White House, like Steve Bannon is on the way out and Jared Kushner is rising, right? That sort of thing, to do that well. Tracking campaign promises versus the reality. Every time Trump goes against something that he claimed in the campaign, it's pretty reliable that the press will point it out. Reporting on conflicts of interest within the Trump family and business ties, which is an important story. I think they've done that pretty well. And there was a lot of anxiety and consternation before inauguration about how the press would handle Trump's Twitter feed. But I think on the whole, journalists have done a good job in not ignoring it, but not allowing it to take over their news agenda. That's something where I think they were ready for that. And they've also connected his Twitter feed and his television watching habits, so we kind of know how these tweets emerge because he's watching TV and he reacts to something and then he talks about it on Twitter, and we pretty much understand that rhythm now. So that's something they've done well. They've got up to speed pretty rapidly on encryption and operational security, meaning if people are going to contact you from within the government, they want to know that they're not being listened to. And journalists have to be good at that. And I think the Washington press, especially after not paying too much attention to that in previous administrations, is gotten up to speed on that very well. They've also learned how to call lies and falsehoods by their right names. It's much more likely now for the press simply to report that is untrue. And the president said many things today that were false. That is pretty common. Also, something surprising is how the PR departments of major news organizations have fought back against distortions coming from Trump and the White House by saying, no, that didn't happen. For example, CNN decided not to have Kellyanne Conway on one day, and she said, that's not true, I actually couldn't make it. And CNN just said, you're wrong. Like, you lied. But they used their PR department to say that, which is something that I don't recall PR departments like taking feisty stands before. They usually try to avoid controversy, but here they're actually welcoming confrontation with the White House, which is pretty good. And they've been successful, this is not a small thing, in appealing to their core audiences for more financial support. As you may know, New York Times, the Washington Post have seen a flood of new subscribers. NPR is raising more money than it used to. Nonprofits like ProPublica are raising more money than ever before. That's good. Now, some things that the press has not done well. I don't think there was any attempt to create an industry-wide post-mortem or season of reflection or 9/11 style commission about what went wrong in the election of 2016. It just didn't happen. There was a lot of angst and anxiety about it, and certainly a lot of panel discussions, but no serious attempt to learn the lessons of 2016. And as a result of that, you don't even see the news industry, the journalism profession, taking steps toward a strategy to address this trust problem. I don't think they're even at the starting line in that race. They've also found it difficult to portray what is happening, not in the White House and among players like Steve Bannon and Jared Kushner and the Secretary of State and the National Security Council, but deeper down in the sprawling federal government, in the EPA, in the Commerce Department, in the agencies and bureaucracies where a lot of the work of the federal government takes place. It's not that we don't get stories about it, we do, but there's no way to sort of keep track of that as a news user. I don't think the press is doing a very good job on that level. And related to that is it's very difficult if you try and follow news of the Trump White House just to know, what should I be paying attention to now? What's most important? How do I divide up my minutes of news reading to make sure that I consume the really important news as opposed to the merely transient? We're not getting a lot of help in that because the news system isn't organized that way. It's organized to give a flood of daily reports today and another flood that replaces it tomorrow. What comes after fact-checking? It clearly doesn't work on Trump. So what comes after it? Nobody knows. We just keep doing fact checks of somebody who doesn't care whether what he says is true. Related to that, I haven't seen journalists respond in a broader sense to the context in which Trump's defiance of facts is taking place. It's not just an attack on the press. It's not just he doesn't care what he's saying is true. It's also, throughout the government, the kind of put down of evidence-based reasoning, the sidelining of science, the revolt against expertise, attacks on what once were respected institutions like the Congressional Budget Office, or anybody who really knows what they're talking about and can serve as a reality check of any kind is at odds with the Trump White House. That's a lot bigger than just hating on the media, but I don't see journalists like addressing that larger question or trying to create alliances with the people who are equally threatened. Also, it's universally agreed within mainstream journalism that when Steve Bannon said, we're going to treat the press as the opposition, that journalists should decline to see themselves that way. Almost all journalists in the mainstream press believe that we're not the opposition and we can't act that way. And I understand why they say that. Another way of putting it was, again, Marty Barron's. He said, we're not at war, we're at work. In other words, we're just doing our job here. We're not at war with you. And I understand why they say that. They don't want to be the opposition party because that would politicize their role. They don't want to be the opposition party because then they would be seen as sort of in league with Trump's political opponents, which is something they don't want to do. And that makes sense as well. However, they have to find a way to oppose things like the attack on evidence, on professionalism, on fact itself, the retreat from reality-based policymaking. Journalists have to oppose that somehow without becoming the opposition party. And I don't think they've made a lot of progress on that. It's partly a conceptual, philosophical problem. I don't think the press has done very well on solidarity, which is working together to outwit these threats and prevent the divide and conquer strategy from working. We see occasional glimpses of solidarity, like when Sean Spicer tries to keep certain news organizations out of the briefing, then other news organizations says, well, we're not going to go either. That's solidarity. If they can't come in, we don't want to come in. That's solidarity. And it does happen every once in a while, but on the whole, divide and conquer works much better, and solidarity is thin and weak within the press. I don't think the press has done very well at creating new institutions and finding allies among people who should be opposing the same things they're opposing in this civic emergency. And finally, the press has not done well at quitting Kellyanne Conway. Why are you still interviewing this person? They don't actually know. I've written about it, and there really isn't any journalistic rationale. This is what I've said in my criticism. There's no journalistic rationale for interviewing Kellyanne Conway in the sense that the only reason you would invite her on the air is as a representative of the president and what he thinks. But frequently we find that what she says doesn't correspond to what the president thinks, so she's actually unreliable at that. Another strange thing about Kellyanne Conway, I don't know if you've noticed this, when you are done listening to her explain something that's going on, you know less. You understand less. So by that token, it also doesn't help the audience to have her on because she's kind of a genius at disabling our understanding. So those are reasons not to have her on. I can't think of any journalistic reasons to keep interviewing her. So she's still on for other reasons. It must be because conflict or to avoid criticism or to show that you're even-handed or something like that. But those are not journalistic reasons. Okay, coming in for a landing, 5 minutes, thank you, Emma. So, I know what you're thinking. It's great that you can lay out these problems, Jay, but what should we do about all this? And I have to admit, I don't have the solution to anything that I've described here. I think it's very hard to solve these problems. And it's not like I know exactly what I would do if I were Marty Baron of the Washington Post or sitting in the press room at the White House. I don't. But I also felt like I want to be doing something that responds to this analysis. So that's why I'm joining forces with The Correspondent, which is a Dutch publication that's been around for 4 years as it tries to expand from the Netherlands to the US. Briefly, The Correspondent was founded in 2013. It's completely member-supported, meaning the readers who are the biggest fans pay $63 a year to support the journalism. They started with about 18,000 of these fans. They now have 56,000 paying members. They have a yearly budget of $3.5 million. They have 21 full-time correspondents, 75 freelancers who are also paid, about 25 support staff. No ads, no sponsors, no tracking, no targeting, no clickbait, no curiosity headlines, because they don't need any of that. They get their money directly from the readers. And that's not really why I'm supporting them, even though they're successful at doing something that others have not done. The reason I'm supporting them is this. Here's how I wrote about it when I introduced this project. What if news organizations optimize every part of their operation for trust, not for speed, traffic, profits, headlines, or prizes, but for trust? What would that look like? Well, it would look a lot like the Correspondent. And you can go to my blog and presstink.org and read about it. It's the first piece there in more detail. But they have started to make the changes necessary to rebuild the relationship with readers on the basis of trust. That is why 56,000 people volunteer their money every year to support this organization, because they trust it. And they do everything they do to maintain that trust. So it's that sense of starting over that I think is very effective, and that's why I'm supporting them in their move to the United States, which is going to take about a year of planning before they open here. Okay, thank you. That's my presentation. Now we're going to hear from Ruth. Ruth?
Okay. So I'm going to start with this image. Can you hear me? I know. What is it? What, do you recognize this? It is the space assigned to the press on the grounds of Mar-a-Lago 3 weeks after the inauguration during the Japanese Prime Minister's state visit. There's another one. This one was posted by Bloomberg reporter Jennifer Jacobs. So I find these pictures deeply disturbing. They're very brutally clear about the model of media-government relations the Trump administration seems to wish to foster. It's a press that's blind, cut off from knowledge of what's going on and who's doing it. So how did we get here to this very depressing reality? So Jay's pointed critiques of American journalism address this question. And I should say, some of the things I'm going to reference, he didn't say here. They're from some of his writings in PressThink. So as he notes, our current state of disorientation comes in part from feeling that serious journalism is, quote, disarmed and disabled. And we just have to look at the camera equipment lying on the floor with nothing to see. And he rightly urges us, what he's doing now, is to take a step back and use this difficult moment to analyze the weaknesses of our current models. He does this very, very well. So in this sphere, as in many others, Trump's ascent to power and his behavior as president are a huge wake-up call. The routines and norms of campaign and presidential communication have been discarded, or rather adjusted to Trump's own habits and preferences. And to repeat a maxim I've been disseminating since the start of the campaign, authoritarians never pivot. They make things and people adapt to them. So this is what we're all struggling to do now, to adapt to our current circumstances, which also means looking at what in the world of journalism might not work anymore, which is Jay's project. And some of the maladies Jay diagnoses are structural ones, and they predate, certainly, our current situation. The influence of big finance, with its own political predilections on the media, is nothing new. In the 1930s, the fascist dictator Benito Mussolini actually had a syndicated column that ran in over 1,000 Hearst newspapers, thanks to the conservative sentiments of that tycoon. And talk about appeasement. Now, with the institutionalization of crony capitalism under Trump and company, this issue may, of course, be harder than ever to address. Now, the access model of journalism, which Jay rightly critiques, has been around for a while, too. With Trump's victory, we're seeing not only payback for the exclusion of Fox News and outlets like Breitbart by Obama, but the dawn of an unfortunately different conception of the function of the press in society. And here, Trump's trashing of the norms of democracy, as you so elegantly put it, is blatant. Having access to the president is a privilege, something that must be earned through a continual demonstration of political fidelity and loyalty to the person of the leader, and it's certainly not loyalty to the party. Trump doesn't give a whit about the GOP. It's a personalization of politics. And this places the press in circumstances conducive to self-censorship and normalization, which, as Jay puts it, is just doing the job. And you're certainly right to say, well, what if the job has changed? And I've also noticed, we've been very dismayed over the campaign, there's been, such a fear to say the truth. And when, right after the election, CNN did a town hall with Bernie Sanders. It was with Chris Cuomo. And Bernie Sanders, being Bernie Sanders, said within 3 minutes, Trump is a pathological liar. And there was like an air of uncomfortableness that descended because he's saying what needs to be said. And this is also it's a kind of consequence of access journalism. So without meaning any disrespect to the wonderful New York Times reporter Maggie Haberman, I found the recent rash of articles lauding her special relationship with Trump an error, and they were in, I think, Politico, and CNN had one. Precisely something to do with her, but it's because it perpetuates the notion that success comes from being in the good graces of the ruler. And this is a totally futile and harmful line of reasoning when dealing with an authoritarian and a narcissist, such as Trump, who, like many of his kind, is also notoriously mercurial. And the example I'd like us to all keep in mind is, of course, more depressing. What happened to CNN's Jim Acosta and Ami's Jake Turks, who Trump tried to humiliate both of them. And these were power performances meant less for Acosta and Turks than their bosses, including Trump's supposed good friend, CNN head Jeff Zucker. Now, an idealist would say, and perhaps did say on Twitter, the next time is what you were talking about, solidarity. The next time Trump or his proxy Spicer tells one of you to sit down, all of you should stand up in mute and unsettling protest. And such gestures are extremely powerful in authoritarian and democratic settings, and we should use them while we can. This is the solidarity mandate. Now, as a historian of propaganda and regimes, I fully agree with Jay about the success of the right's attack dog model of media coverage, which aims to discredit and sow distrust. And the right has been able to channel political fervor through its impassioned media style and stars. Now, I know elsewhere, not here, you made a point about the dangers of inflamed journalism, how it can lead to more polarization. And I'd also say it could lead to fatigue in consumers, like shock journalism. So we certainly don't want to go that route. But we can learn from the appeal and that the fire of Bernie Sanders had. It can translate into new screen and radio talent who could become vessels of the outrage that its liberals turn to feel, while keeping to a notion of journalism distinguished by commitment to factual accuracy and integrity. Now, another way to beat the right at its own game without sacrificing standards might be for journalism to immerse itself ever more in the world of images. We are an image-driven culture. Facebook's supposed to morph into Snapchat. And this is changing, I think, what news means in the minds of consumers. Now, Trump has been really savvy at this. He built his base not only through rallies and his charisma, but by understanding the power of images to sear into the mind. And I started writing for CNN when I saw him retweeting racist propaganda, and I thought, uh-oh, he really knows what he's doing. And by consistently retweeting this kind of racist stuff, he introduced Americans not only into a lexicon of hatred, like Jew-America and all this lexicon of the alt-right, but to what passes for news sources in the alt-right world. And so this was from November 2015, early. And this was tweeted by him, and this is kind of fake statistics, along with a kind of gangster image. And I wrote an article for CNN about that, like as soon as I saw it. And he did parallel things with Hispanics and other groups that he's trying to target. So this retweet can be considered a campaign communication. So future Democratic or other political candidates might want to demonstrate themselves as visually and Twitter literate as Trump. And the media will, we hope, be better prepared to cover them. Now, here's the thing about Trump. He reveals as much as he conceals. Authoritarians are often shameless. It's part of them informing us very early on who they are and what their priorities will be if we are dumb enough to vote them into power. So Trump told us what he was not going to release his tax returns. He told us he had open lines. Sorry, I'm not showing this. He told us he had open lines with Putin. I mean, at a campaign rally, he said, if you're listening, I hope you'll be able to find the emails that are missing. And then he added, and you'll be rewarded by the press. And he also told us he's capable of violence without any consequences, and thus that he considers himself above the law. This is the famous, I could stand on Fifth Avenue. So he's been pretty open, including about what he's refusing to tell us, thumbing his nose at us. Now, in his very prescient Press Think essay of December 2016, which I urge everybody to read, Jay notes, quote, that there's a crisis of representation around covering Trump, and this is very evocative. Now, months before, in accepting the nomination, Trump had staged that crisis. This is an unbelievable image. If you study political theater and authoritarians and just about anything. And some people said, oh yeah, there's fog and he's like a rock star, he's got a big ego. But it's more than that. Here he's a menacing shadow. He's telling us, as he kept doing with other things, that he's going to be a different kind of president. This is the point Jay was making before. The media wasn't ready. None of us were ready. But he was telling us that indeed he was going to be a different kind of president. And so he's in our faces all the time, and yet he's opaque, right? So how the press resolves this crisis with the backing of the public and other institutions will determine how much damage Trump's able to do to our democracy over time. I'll stop there.
We're going to ask questions to go to this mic right here so that we can get you on the live stream and we can hear you, the people who are not in the room. So if somebody brave would like to come up to the mic and be the first, ask a question, we would love that. Meanwhile, I want to ask Ruth something. You were a close observer of Silvio Berlusconi in Italy. I'd love to hear what parallels and contrasts you draw between the two.
Yeah, that's is my mic on? Yep. Good. That's he is in some ways the the closest person in terms of conflicts of interest, in terms of attacks on the media, and someone who came in with a personal brand and a kind of hero worship of him as a success. So he's very instructive. It's not a very optimistic ending. One of the things that happened is that just the scale of his conflicts of interest and the scale of his investments and the problems he presented were so vast that people didn't know where to start first. And so that's a structural factor that is in common. And just when we think we were making progress with Trump, here come all of Jared's conflicts of interest, not to speak of Ivanka. And it's, you don't know where to start. But it's not done in a neutral climate. He's also trying to change the libel laws to sue he's very litigious, just like Trump. So one of the things that happened, unfortunately, is he came in briefly, just long enough to bring the neo-fascists back to power. Thank you very much. And these kind of separatist, northern, racist people both of whom are still around, even though he's gone. And then he came back again for a long period, and studies have found that toward the end of his rule, and he was booted out not because of his conflicts of interest or his corruption or his mafia associations, but because of the Eurozone crisis. The economy was failing, and people were fed up. But studies were showing in polls that people had more tolerance for corruption and conflict of interest than before he came in, because they grew used to it. It became a normal part of the profile of the leader. And this is perhaps the most serious lesson among many we can choose from. Now, the other part is that Berlusconi was the head of Italy, and Italy can't do as much damage as we can. When Berlusconi calls, Berlusconi was like this with Putin, and they had all kinds of oil deals and things that were going on. But when if he called Erdogan to congratulate him on being such a good dictator in the making, it doesn't have the impact of when Trump does it today. So that's a big difference.
Excellent. We have some questions. Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Can you tell us who you are for?
Yeah, my name is Eric Tikkanen. I have a general question on the media and two of the largest stories that really have gone unaddressed. First story is post-2006, the media's promotion and elevation of false equivalence in both sides journalism, which allowed Republicans to escape blame for the disaster that was 2000 to 2006. And second, how that accelerated what was already the fact that the Republican Party has completely gone off the cliff in terms of its own, in terms of radicalism and extremism, and how that's not a story at all on the news. So,
okay, thanks. Well, I think after many years of complaints about exactly what you said, Eric, the term false equivalence, the notion of false balance, the general perception that he said, she said journalism is kind of lame, has in fact risen, and journalists are much more aware of this than they used to be. And they are more sensitive to these complaints. In fact, sometimes they'll say before they even get the complaint, this is not false equivalence because they're anticipating that criticism, which 10 years ago that didn't happen. Where they have not done as good a job is in coming to grips with and portraying what I called earlier asymmetric polarization. So when you have something that's happening on both sides, polarization, but it's happening much more dramatically in a different, more serious way on one, it's very difficult for the press to handle it because there's evidence for it on both sides, and it's easy to take that evidence and make it look symmetrical, and symmetry plays well on television, and it's great to have the person from the left and the person from the right, and it leaves journalists in the middle, and there's a lot of comfort to that position. So there's sort of like structural reasons why that form of reporting appeals to them. And as a result of being unable to cope with asymmetric polarization, they were floored by the events of 2016. Because that notion of asymmetric polarization is actually necessary to understand what's been happening in politics in this country. And if you kind of are prevented by your own professional code from realizing that, it's very hard to understand what's going on. So it's been something I've written about a lot. Awareness is on the rise, but it's still not good enough.
Okay.
I was going to answer the second question.
Yeah.
Why the kind of radicalism of the GOP is not a story. And I've always found this interesting because I come to American politics. If you told me, 2 years ago I'd be writing about Ted Cruz for CNN, I would have thought you were insane. Because I come to American politics from studying Europe and fascisms and regimes. But it's been very useful. This has been the question on my mind. The violence, the violent rhetoric, and the tip of the iceberg was, but most prominent was, the number of state representatives calling for Clinton's, execution by firing squad. And a lot of that is misogyny, but not all. And I always say, the reason it's not a story is a four-letter word, which is guns. This is what, you can't talk about white terrorism also because of it's racism and it's guns. And I was doing a radio show, and I had just published something in CNN on Stephen King, his racist, this demographic stuff that we shouldn't have other people's babies. And I said offhandedly, if he's so worried about white people declining in America, the answer is gun control. And I got like 200 messages of hate, more than usual. Usually I get 100. I got 200. So you cannot mention guns. So this is part of it. There's a lot invested in keeping the puzzle pieces apart on that issue.
At times, it seems as if Trump is strangely in control of his message and behavior. Like if you see him in depositions, for example. But it appears, maybe it's conspicuous by its absence, but that he doesn't always attack everyone who's going after him by parodying him. Like, for example, like Colbert, for example, and there's others. So I'm wondering why you think that is, or is he being more selective in who he attacks?
This is the kind of question about Trump that I'm never able to answer. Like people, it's related to, is he doing this as a strategy, or is he just doing this by reacting? Is he instinctive, or is he calculated? And I can never decide. I don't know if you have a strong feeling about that, Ruth, or not, but to me, it's impossible to know how much deliberation goes into what he's doing versus narcissistic rage.
And it seems to be part of it's a continuum. It's not black and white.
Well, it's
Some of
not.
it is.
It's a continuum, yes. But one thing I would add on this is a lot of people in journalism and a lot of people who I talk to on social media are very strongly of the belief that Donald Trump is some sort of media genius and wizard. And he is frequently described as having like incredible media skills, and he's a genius at generating attention. And Maggie Haberman, who you mentioned, Ruth, describes him as a genius in manipulating journalists. And I don't think that's true at all. I don't think he has any knowledge of these systems. I don't think he's subtle. I don't think he's skillful in the least. What is different about him, and the reason he succeeds so well as sort of an object of attention, is that he is utterly shameless, and that he's willing to do things in the public spotlight that a normal person would never do. And a normal person's family would prevent them from doing that. Like if you had a wife who was loyal and loved you, she would say, don't do that, everybody hates you, right? But he doesn't have that kind of family. And there's a reason why he doesn't, because he's a raging narcissist. So we've never had a president who was utterly shameless and sort of almost literally uncivilized in that way. And because we're not used to that, and we're used to the opposite. We're used to public figures who are very controlled, who don't want to be embarrassed publicly, who try to observe the norms of society, right? It's a shock, and the shock is what leads to media coverage, and that becomes addictive to the media platforms that are profiting from it, right? So a lot of what is called media wizardry by Trump is actually utter shamelessness.
And lastly, is there any model in financial journalism for what you're trying to accomplish here, in the sense that, for many of us, over many years, there's an adversarial relationship sometimes between companies and the journalists that are reporting on them.
Yeah.
And some are very, very clever over many, many years at coloring their stories in the right way. And it takes a long time and a lot of deep journalism to get it uncovered. Like we just look at what happened with John Carreyrou and Lizzie recently.
Yeah.
Right? And Wall Street Journal puts it out as an example of, well, this is really good journalism. And there's been other examples also. AmTrust also had many articles written about it. I don't know if you're familiar with that case or not.
No, I'm not.
But you can take a look, and Roddy covered that.
Well, the financial journalism presents good models and bad models. I wish the financial press had been more on it in 2007 and 2008. That wasn't such a great performance. On the other hand, the Theranos case in the Wall Street Journal is an example of a very responsible financial press pointing out that this company was a fraud, and it worked the way it's supposed to work. So I don't think this is an easy problem. Covering Trump is not an easy problem. And what I tried to point out in my comments was he's so different that you can't use the operating system you had before. But the press wants to use the operating system that it had before because it's hard to come up with a new one on the fly. That's the point I was trying to make. Ruth,
Okay,
you wanted to
I'll
add
go
to
through.
something this?
Yeah, I agree with all you said. In terms of the question of, what it is very difficult to answer. There is a little bit of order you can, find, because, especially with reference to history, and it's not good news, because there have been people like him who kind of have this charisma and this impulsivity, and they revel in contradicting themselves and being unpredictable. And one of them was Mussolini. One of them was Berlusconi, loved the shock value. He went to the stock exchange, he opened the stock exchange, and he made a pronouncement about, everybody should invest in Italy because it has the hottest women in the world. This is, and many worse things. This was very PG. But there's also a method to their madness, in that if you look over a century of these people, they always go for the same targets. They all focus on the media, and not in a positive way. They all attack judges. A lot of them attack intellectuals and or professors. Look at Erdogan. He's got hundreds of professors sitting there in jail now. So there are these people who arrive at moments in history, and they have enormous charisma. And part of their the reason they can form these bonds with people that last, unfortunately, once these bonds are formed, it's really hard to break them, is because of their kind of craziness and impulsivity. When Trump is tweeting at 3 a.m, and there's somebody who can't sleep, he's making this bond, this kind of community. The person feels he's there for them. And it might sound corny, but, and again, I don't think he's a genius. I think he can't sleep, and he has no attention span, and he wants to tweet, right? But there are these people who arrive, and they coalesce existing kind of anxieties and angers, and they can make a movement out of it. And they tend to have a similar personality. I don't want to do the great men of history theory, but they tend to have similar traits. So
just lastly, I don't have the answer, but I don't know how you're going to disseminate all these ideas out to a wider audience. I mean, you have a core group that follows journalism, is really interested in this stuff, but you have a lot of educated people that just go on with their lives and may just read an article or two, but and that's the more educated people. But then you have another wider group that is only going to somehow bond with this if it's presented in the right way. And I don't know how to do that, but
I don't either.
yeah.
Thanks.
Jay, you had brought up the issue that journalists are reluctant to either explore or report on any sort of like narcissistic psychological issue with Donald Trump. And I was curious as to whether you had thought, and I never heard of this term before I heard it on the No Agenda podcast, but could it possibly be related to the Goldwater rule? That, I mean,
Sure.
obviously journalists are not psychiatrists, but do you think that's a factor?
Yeah, well, the Goldwater rule, let's fill in the context here, is something that the psychology and psychiatry community developed after 1964 when psychiatrists felt free describing Barry Goldwater as kind of nuts. And they psychoanalyzed him from a distance. And upon reflection, the professional associations that govern ethical behavior in psychiatry and psychology took a dim view of the behavior of the professionals who had done that because, they said, you can't make a diagnosis of someone that you have not examined. Right? You can't do it by reading their speeches. You can't do it by watching them on television. And to try and diagnose somebody who you don't have a patient-doctor relationship with is unethical. And I believe the American Psychiatric Association actually passed a rule saying you couldn't do this, which would mean that you would face professional censure. You'd be called unethical if you did. And the American Psychological Association, they're the people who don't have the MDs, they have PhDs, maybe didn't have a rule, but it certainly had an attitude about it. And so that is a factor because otherwise what journalists could do is they could call up a psychiatrist and they'd say, is Trump a narcissist? And get a quote. And they really aren't able to do that because of this prohibition. But, and that's why you see this subject coming up in things like letters to the editor and opinion columns. And there are like a whole movement of psychiatrists, therapists, and psychologists who are kind of like reacting against this and who have said we shouldn't be restricted, by the Goldwater.
Constrained.
Yeah. And then there are others who say no, it's still unethical. So it's sort of like a tug of war within the profession. But there's nothing to prevent journalists from learning about narcissistic personality disorder and saying, man, he has quite a few of the characteristics associated with this diagnosis. But my point was not so much that journalists should be like clinicians and pronouncing the president sick. It's more that many of his actions don't make any sense without a concept like that. That was my point. Not that they should play doctor, but that it's hard to understand who the president is and why he's doing what he's doing unless you use something like that. Does that make sense?
Yes. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Hi. Tell us who you are.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Wood. You mentioned earlier, one of the things that the press is doing well is covering, I think you called it internal turmoil,
Palace intrigue.
Palace
Yeah.
intrigue. I guess I'm curious why specifically that is good, because at times it feels like a distraction. A lot of times these are roles that we can't elect, we can't have any voice in, so it becomes either a distraction or maybe some like really gross catharsis or something, I don't know, to see like infighting within. So I guess I'm just curious as to why you mentioned that as something that's good.
Yeah, it's a great question. Ruth, do you have any view on that? I have a view on this, but if you have something. Okay. Well, I said it was something that they were doing well. I didn't say that doing it is so great. Okay. In that, I think palace intrigue or internal turmoil appeals to Washington journalists for some reasons that aren't so encouraging.
Yeah.
One is that it's a story that persists administration to administration. Like you always have that, right? So it's sort of eternal. Right? You always have factions within the White House fighting with one another. Mm-hmm. And so it's like you can haul out of storage a script that you already know. And this is not so great because as I've tried to explain in my talk, Trump is different. And so every time you haul out of storage a script that you know well, you're risking distorting what's going on because we have somebody who doesn't resemble previous presidents. Another reason that I think journalists are attracted to that story is that it's easy to understand, and it simplifies a really complex picture, which is, what is this administration actually doing to change the government and change the relationship between citizens and their government? Like, that's a hard thing to report on. That's a hard thing to narrate. And it's a lot easier if we can just fix on the struggles within the White House, because it's sort of like a family, you know, in conflict, or a workplace where people hate the boss, or, you know, it's reductive. And then the other reason why it's attractive to journalists is because when different factions in the White House, but this would be true of any company, would be true of any palace in another country, any power situation like this, when different factions develop within an executive branch, then one way that people try to beat the other side is by leaking dirt about them. You know, that's like one of the simplest methods of undermining your rival, is to leak a bad story about them. And it's not fake news, it's not made up, it's not fictional, but it also doesn't tell us anything about this White House because it happens in every White House. You see what I mean? So I'm not that impressed with that story, and if I had predicted what stories would the press be good at covering before Trump was inaugurated, that's one that I would have picked because it's so predictable.
Yeah, I'd also say it's important, very important in this administration that they're doing it because, you know, from what we read, the decision-making process on even national security and, you know, things that are enormous consequences has been winnowed to this inner circle of 3 people, 4 people, right? No one's being consulted. They're not filling jobs. So all the normal routines and bureaucratic procedures, even at an almost very high level, have been cast aside or minimized. So, and the other thing is, who are these people? We're all going around pretending this is normal, that these people like Stephen Bannon, and then Jared Kushner. Who is Jared Kushner? He happens to be the president's son-in-law, but he's a guy who went to Harvard. His parents did whatever they did. They bought him into Harvard, and he's a decent businessman probably. But why is he in Iraq? Why is he doing these things? So if there's palace intrigue and Stephen Bannon gets, who is the classic thug of the first hour you need to get into power, all these kind of populist and fascistic regimes of the past always had a Stephen Bannon who directed these thugs. And then they get pushed aside or demoted. And the smooth ones take over, and this would be Kushner. So it is interesting to cover this, but it's important because, you know, I do think we're living in sometimes, and I'm very close to all this stuff, and I think we're in some kind of weird dream where, why are these people even in office? Ivanka, what is she doing there? What are we doing? And yet he has power, and we're forced to kind of pretend, and the press most of all, that this is all okay. So covering these internecine struggles is particularly important.
Yeah. Did we answer your question?
Definitely. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Hi, tell us who you are.
My name's Colin Rust. I have a question about investigative journalism in our media ecosystem. And in all honesty, it's not a problem that's new with Donald Trump, but I think takes on new salience. So if there's a press release or Trump tweets or something, you know, every media venue, every newspaper, every broadcast channel makes a story on that, and that's very easy, right? But if one venue goes and does, you know, deep research and, you know, does a ton of work to do some deeply reported investigative journalism, that's often not picked up. I mean, especially if it's by a smaller outfit, if it's by The Intercept or Mother Jones or something, it's really got to be at an incredibly high sort of blockbuster level to penetrate. Mm-hmm. But I'd argue that's even a problem with the New York Times and the Washington Post. If they have a scoop the other one's going to cover it probably, but, on page 19, whereas today's press release went on page 1. So I just feel like there's a mismatch in terms of like both in terms of like the investment that the journalists have to do and frankly in terms of how important it really should be to the public and how much coverage it gets. Why is that? It's probably partly because of sort of proprietariness around the scoops and so on. So my question is, I mean, if you agree that that's a problem, what can we do about it? What can we do to reduce that problem?
Okay. Well, this is part of what I meant by I'm not impressed with the solidarity that has been shown within the press because they're in a civic emergency. They're part of this struggle with an authoritarian ruler who is undermining the norms of democracy. And it's a more stressful and threatening situation the press has been in my view, since World War I. And so in that situation, what we need are professional journalists who are able to put aside their smaller rivalries and realize that the big rivalry is between them and this ruler, right? And we've seen some of that. There has been some progress in that area. I don't want to portray the situation as black and white because it's not. There is more collaboration now across news organizations than there used to be. That is definitely something that has happened. There have been leading news organizations like ProPublica, which is a nonprofit investigative newsroom here in New York, that make it their business to share their work with others, to partner with others, to, for example, when they do a big investigation, they hand the reporting recipe that they followed to local news organizations so they can do the same investigation in Kansas City, in San Diego. That's a very good thing. It's a very positive thing. And so it is changing, but it's not changing fast enough to cope with how threatening the environment is getting. So the pace of change is not adequate. Finally, I would say that competition in journalism means something very strange. It's very normal to journalists, but it's really weird to me as an observer. Because usually we valorize competition as everybody does different things, and therefore we get the best result because everyone let 1,000 followers, boom, right? In the press, competition means everyone does the same thing, and I try to get it 5 minutes before you do, right? And that's competition. And that's a really weird notion of competition because it might work for sort of the internal credit claiming games of the profession, but it doesn't produce the best outcomes overall, right? And so, yeah, I sympathize with what you're saying. I think the news system as a whole isn't organized very rationally. It's not able to always forward something very important that's discovered over here to the center so that everybody can publicize it. And then things that everyone does publicize, like controversy of the day, ridiculous tweet, don't necessarily deserve the broad attention they get, right? So we have a screwed up news system in which attention and priorities don't match, but part of the reason it doesn't change is that the press isn't really an institution. It's sort of a collection of individual institutions. And it's very hard to change that institution because it doesn't have any structure, right? So sometimes I call journalists a herd of independent minds. A herd of independent minds, which is, you get the worst of both worlds because they're acting like a herd, right? But if they were really a herd, you could redirect the herd, because that's what sheepdogs are for, right? But they're a herd of independent minds, so they conform to like what everyone else is doing, but they think of themselves as individuals, so it makes it very difficult to redirect that institution. And that's one of the things that the White House and Trump is exploiting, is the lack of leadership and institutional vitality in the press. So to take the simplest example, and then I'll wrap this up, we can't even get the White House press corps to abandon that stupid dinner. I mean, that's like a no-brainer. That's not even something that you have to do. It's just something you have to stop doing. right? Just something stupid that you should stop doing. We can't even get that done. So that's upsetting. Thanks for your question. Yes, sir.
Thanks. My name's Kirk Chaffins. So I heard you say that you were having trouble, like the rest of us undoubtedly, figuring out why reality has been shoved aside.
Do you know?
In so many ways. I have a theory.
Okay.
And the theory, let me confess, my brother's an academic and wrote a book that just came out called The Disinformation Age.
Oh.
And he got me, he's at Cornell, and he got me thinking, because I'm a former journalist. There are so many assumptions that we never questioned as journalists. And many of them, of course, turn out to be completely untrue. The American dream, quote unquote, is completely at odds with the economic statistics, or whether it's achievable or not. The land of liberty is completely at odds with the land of mass incarceration. The mythology that our presidents have stood for, right up to and very much including our dearly beloved Barack Obama, who I voted for twice and worked for, but said a lot of things that were demonstrably at odds with the facts, and nobody in journalism ever called him on it. People in academia called him on it. And there's that kind of line. And I'm wondering if we as journalists have contributed to a time when reality doesn't matter because because there are so many lies floating around, not to put too fine an edge on it. And that's both a question, a theory, and a proposition.
Okay. What do you think, Bruce?
I mean, I think you could say that about, I mean, all institutions have their functional lies that they, like the Catholic Church or other, religious, the Catholic Church just has a certain prominence in this. But yeah, no, that's all I have to say. I think that it's an interesting proposition, and it can apply to extra political things as well.
Right, and I think journalism, of course, is not the only institution that people have lost faith in. And then I'll shut up. But the companion question is, okay, if nobody has any faith in journalism, why are Trump's popularity ratings historically low? Because not very many people know him or have direct access, right? So somebody, I mean, a lot of people are paying attention, even though they're saying, I'm not paying attention and I don't
I
trust
think
you.
if we had a member of the White House press corps here to respond to what I said, one of the things I'm pretty sure they would say is, why do you think his approval ratings are so low? It's because of what we have reported. And they said that during the campaign, that is, they credited themselves, and reasonably so, for his unpopularity with a huge portion of the public. But to get to your question, I think maybe one reason reality is sort of the loser in our age is the long-term effects of impartial journalism. If you have a commitment to balance, to impartiality, to portraying both sides, and the world starts to become asymmetrical, then you are distorting it every single time you portray it. And over time, that can have an effect, right? So if the world is becoming warmer and global warming is real, and we have a BBC that is structurally, legislatively committed to impartial reporting, over time, every time the BBC reports on climate change for a period of years, it's distorting climate change, right? Now, eventually they corrected themselves. They don't do that anymore. And they actually had to have internal studies and task forces, and they actually had to send middle managers in the BBC, like, to deprogramming school. So they didn't do this anymore because it became a problem. So maybe that's one of the answers, is that as the world has grown more asymmetrical and out of consensus, a consensus model in journalism persisted, and it distorted the world. And then people began to lose faith in that, right? And so maybe that's part of the answer. I don't know. But this is one where I think people in my profession, your profession, our profession, Ruth, have to do a better job. Thanks for your question. Thank you. Yes.
Hi, I'm Sally Murphy. I'm really interested in your new project
Yeah.
and hoping that it's successful. Concerned that I think somebody else commented about how you will get an audience for this who's willing to pay for it. I don't know how to help you comment on that, but to see the declines and to see the polarity in what people are interested in reading and to realize that people are believing fake news and interested in reading that kind of stuff has me worried or concerned that you will be able to find an audience that's willing to pay when so much is available for free.
Right.
I mean, I know plenty of people have difficulty getting their subscribers and their members to pay and really do rely on advertising and sponsorship.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we don't know if it's
Yeah.
going to work. It's a gamble. It's an unknown. You know, it's like a struggle with an unknown outcome.
Yeah.
But one reason why I'm somewhat optimistic that we can find those people is Americans are changing their attitudes about this. People pay for a lot more news than they used to in the first decade or so of the digital age. And in this atmosphere of civic emergency that I referred to, we have seen a flood of financial support to news organizations. The New York Times subscribers, way up. Washington Post, way up. Wall Street Journal, way up. Public radio, nonprofits like ProPublica, all, Mother Jones, Nation, all have reported a surge of financial support. So that's good. That means both that people are willing to put down their money, but also that they're able to recognize a different situation, right, and respond to that. Mm-hmm. So there's that. The other thing that makes me optimistic about this model is that the correspondent operates at such a different level and achieves trust at such a more basic level that I don't think Americans are even familiar with it. So, for example, because they don't have ads, because they don't have traffic goals, because they don't have clickbait, because they don't care about any of those things, all they care about is, do members renew? That's it. That's the only thing you have to do to be successful as the editor of the correspondent, right? So 2 years into their experiment, members came to the correspondent and started telling the editors, you're publishing too much stuff. We can't keep up.
Yeah.
And it was a problem because when you support something but you can't keep up, you kind of feel bad about it. It's like the New Yorkers pile up on your coffee
like
table.
the New Yorker.
Yeah. Like, and you think, you look at the New Yorkers piling up in your coffee table and you think, this is crazy. I'm paying to feel bad about not reading these New Yorkers, right? There's something like really crazy about that. So they come to the correspondent with this complaint. You're publishing too much stuff. Correspondent editors listen, they say, maybe that's true. So they cut what they're doing from 7 to 8 articles a day to 3 to 4.
Wow.
But same number of writers, 3 to 4 articles instead of 7 to 8. What does that mean? It means each article can take longer, which means it can be better, right? Which means people will support it even more because not only is the journalism better, but they don't have this terrible feeling of, I wasn't able to read it all, right? So the only loser in that are the daily traffic figures. But if you don't care about the daily traffic figures, because all you really care about is will people renew at the end of the year, then it's no problem. So, like, that's what I mean, is that system is so much more rational than the media system we have now that is click-driven and ratings-driven, that I'm counting on people to be smart enough to see that. Not 313 million people, but maybe 100,000 people.
That would be great. I mean, there is a big difference between the Netherlands and America.
There is.
but-
There is. But we're going to take a year to study those differences. And
Yeah,
That's part of the
It's
project.
very
plan.
interesting. Yeah, good luck.
Thank you. We have 5 minutes. Yeah.
You have, I think, started to answer this a minute ago, but can you describe a little bit more what a newsroom that's based on trust looks like, and what it looks like for a newsroom that's based on trust to, if I understood you correctly, work on rehabilitating and defending evidence and reasoning if there is a relationship between those two goals?
Yeah. Well, the way the correspondent does it, the trust transaction, the trust relationship is fundamentally grounded in the relationship between writers and readers. And writers have a great deal of freedom in choosing their subjects, and they are required through a weekly email to tell their followers, the readers who care the most about their journalism, what they're working on, what they're struggling with, what kind of knowledge they need the help with from the readers. And part of the trust bond is that people feel involved in the journalism, somewhat like they felt with David Fahrenthold's reporting in the 2016 campaign, if you were a follower of his, where you are let into how the reporting is put together, you see it building, and you trust it because you know how much work went into it. So that's one answer. Another answer is the correspondent doesn't have any commitment to view from nowhere, objectivity, doesn't require you to be balanced, it doesn't prevent you from drawing conclusions in your reporting, having a point of view. But it says to its writers, if you change your point of view because of your reporting, you have to explain that to the readers. So it never does he said, she said journalism, but it does do I used to think this and now I think that journalism. And you have to explain how you got from one place to another. And that's leveling with readers in a way that a lot of journalists don't do, right? So that's trust-based reporting. Third, they're very aggressive in seeking information, knowledge from the readers that make the reporting better. But one of the things the readers have to understand in that relationship is we can't use it unless we can verify it. It has to be public. It has to be checkable. It has to be reliable. And in a way, the readers are responsible for how reliable the correspondent is because they have to give information that can actually be used, right? So, so there's that. There's the fact that you're not being tracked, you're not being segmented, you're not being marketed to, you're not being demographicked to death, you're not being pitched to, and because there's no selling going on in any way at the site, it has a completely different feel. It doesn't feel like a commercial site that's trying to like grab your attention and, you know, like put something in front of you because you came to read an article. You know how news sites do that, right? And all of a sudden you're like fighting the site that you came to try and get to the thing that you thought you were going to read. I mean, okay, so you know what I'm talking about. So what I'm trying to suggest is that pattern affects trust at a very deep, almost cognitive level where the product is fighting you. So you never had that at the correspondent. So that's what I mean by optimized for trust. Like, and if you just go through the way they operate, and every decision they make is meant not to maximize traffic, profit, controversy, conflict, drama, but to maximize trust. We are out of time. I am so sorry. Ruth, I want to thank you so much for doing this with me. It was so great to have an historian here. And thank you to everyone who showed up. It was fantastic of you to do so. And thank you to my wife and my son who are sitting in the front row. Good night, everybody.